He opened a box of vacuum-treated soil and mixed it with water and soil. Then he placed a spoonful of soil at a certain distance and planted the cut potatoes. Half a month later, the abandoned wasteland miraculously grew teeth. This piece of land became his only hope for survival in the next 4 years. Because this is Mars, 5 million kilometers away from the Earth, he was trapped on this deserted planet. A few months ago, a Martian storm suddenly appeared, interrupting the exploration mission of this team. Astronaut Mark was accidentally hit by flying debris. The detection system showed that his spacesuit was damaged. In this pressure environment, astronauts have no chance of survival. The captain wanted to go to the rescue, but the spaceship was about to be blown down by the storm. If they didn't start up, they would all be left here. In an emergency, the captain had to order an evacuation. They escaped successfully, but did not celebrate because Mark had left them forever. Meanwhile, NASA announced the disaster and determined the death of astronaut Mark. However, Mark, who died in the base camp, woke up from his coma. The antenna inserted in his abdomen and the blood sealed the gap in his spacesuit, which allowed him to survive. He returned to the temporary base not far away with great pain. He first pulled out the antenna inserted in his abdomen and then sutured the bleeding wound. Fortunately, his internal organs were not damaged, but he lost all contact with the outside world. The violent black storm raged across Mars as if it was going to blow away everything on the surface. The base was shaking constantly in the storm. Mark could only the tormented people endure. If even a crack is blown inside, the entire base will explode due to the pressure. The best way to eliminate fear is to defeat it. So he began to collect all the items he could use. Unfortunately, there was nothing he wanted in the base, and he did not lose confidence because of this. 3 days later, the weather finally turned for the better, and Mark Tant's heart settled down. He began to make the next escape plan. There were still 4 years before the next mission, and if he wanted to survive, he had to ensure that he had enough food. But the food here was only enough for him to survive for more than a year, which was obviously far from enough. However, after another great consumption, he suddenly got inspiration and successfully found a way to solve the problem of food. This was a gift that should have been opened on Thanksgiving, a bag of fresh potatoes. This made Mark very relieved and excited, just because he was still a botanist, and he could use this bag of potatoes to grow potato for the remaining 3 years. He first collected all the vacuum-treated fields, which are natural organic fertilizers, and then put the base. The studio was transformed into a greenhouse and covered with thick Martian soil. Then, it was like planting on Earth, with wet fertilizer, planting and irrigation. But new problems immediately emerged. For plants to grow healthily, each bottle of potato need water, and 126 bottles need a lot of water. However, this is impossible on Mars. But this is not difficult for Mark. He can use a warning of the fuel used by the spacecraft to catalyze nitrogen and hydrogen. As long as the hydrogen is ignited, it can be turned into water. Although the first ignition was successful, an explosion occurred due to a miscalculation. However, he did not intend to give up the second time. He was well protected. Fortunately, this time he succeeded. In this way, he successfully solved the water problem. Ahead of time, he also put the sandstorm. After cleaning up the blown solar panels, he had a rich harvest a few months later. The big ones were enough to be kept as food, and the small ones were used to continue growing food. The problem of food was solved. Now all he had to do was find a way to get in touch with the Earth. At the same time, his funeral was being held on Earth. The staff of the Satellite Communication Department accidentally discovered the changes in the Mars base. The solar panels had traces of being tidied by someone, and the location of the exploration vehicle had also moved. He deduced from this that Mark was not dead, so the most difficult rescue in history began. This was the first generation of unmanned Mars probe, which had lost contact with Earth as early as 1997 due to battery problems. Mark found him and connected the Pathfinder. At the same time, the United States and the General Administration of Space Administration far away on Earth also successfully received the signal and immediately started the camera of the Explorer synchronously. In this way, Mark, who had been trapped on Mars for 4 months, finally successfully contacted the Earth. The most difficult rescue in the history of the Earth also began. A few days ago, the United States and the administration discovered changes on Mars. The solar panels and the exploration vehicle all showed signs of movement. From this, it was inferred that Mark was not dead. The news broke out instantly. It set off a big media explosion. Reporters rushed to interview the director about the rescue plan. But the director didn't want to figure out how to make a plan. Instead, he wanted to suppress the public opinion. The official answer made the reporters very dissatisfied. Fortunately, the director of aerospace appeared in time and restored the credibility of the network, but his answer put pressure on the director. Because if you want to save Mark, you must first release him to keep him alive. But it takes 6 months to build and transport the spacecraft for the upgrade. The director immediately compressed it to 3 months, because if it exceeds 3 months, Mark will be starved to death. This has become a problem that they must solve at the moment. But what they don't know is that Mark, a botanist, has already grown Martian potatoes. Having solved the basic survival problem, he suddenly thought of a way to contact the Earth while studying the map of Mars. At the same time, the space agency discovered Mark's range of activities. It was getting bigger and bigger, but no one knew where it was going. That's why the director of aerospace suddenly thought of something. He knew Mark's purpose with the help of the map in the restaurant. It turned out that his target was the first-generation Mars probe that had lost contact with the Earth in 1997. This instrument had an important function, photo transmission. With Mark's efforts, it finally made initial contact with the Earth. But this instrument had a fatal flaw. It took half an hour to transmit a photo. In order to accurately and effectively convey, Mark arranged the numbers around the probe in a circle according to the 16 prohibitions. He only needed to record the numbers that the lens was aimed at when it rotated, and then he could accurately decode it. Then, with the help of technicians, Mark connected the rover's system to the detector's transmission system so that they could communicate without any obstacles. Mark's every move on Mars was broadcast live around the world. He often showed off the miracles he created. His optimistic and cheerful attitude infected all those who cared about him. The construction of the spacecraft was also carried out smoothly according to the plan until one day an accident happened. After finishing his work, Mark returned to the base as usual, but the ballast suddenly moved a little. Affected by the pressure, the base exploded. Fortunately, Mark used the airbag he carried with him to seal his body and the flight mask to save his life. Unfortunately, his potatoes were exposed to the Martian atmosphere and were all frozen to death. The next day, Mark could only seal the damaged exit with plastic sheeting. The base resumed normal operation, but he was still in danger. He cleared his own food and ate one potato every 3 days. If it is enough, it can last for more than 600 days, but it will take 900 days destination. The situation was urgent. The director required that the construction of the spacecraft must be completed in a short time. However, there was an error in the blindness. A month later, a transport spacecraft was launched. However, it exploded just after it left the Earth. In this way, the first rescue mission was declared a failure. They filled the Chinese Apollo with supplies. With the successful launch of the rocket, it docked with the American space station. Then they went full speed ahead and headed for Mars. The purpose of their trip was to rescue Mark, who had been trapped on Mars for more than 300 days. The reason why China participated in the rescue can be traced back to a few days ago. A sudden explosion destroyed the potatoes that Mark had carefully replanted, shortening its instinctive food supply of 900 days to 600 days. In order to give Mark food as soon as possible, the director of the Supplies Bureau shortened the time to build the spacecraft to 1 month, which resulted in the hastily built spacecraft exploding just after it flew out of the Earth. Mark was completely in despair, and even left a book behind. Just when everyone was in despair, an expert in astrodynamics found a turning point. Through his calculations, he found a way to fly to Mars in 561 days. This surprised everyone with the flying mouse. His plan was as follows. The book fixer was the returning space station. The director represented the Earth. His suggestion was to keep the space station at a speed and orbit the Earth for 1 week while receiving supplies sent from the Earth. Then it would accelerate to Mars. After 561 days, it would fly to the orbit of Mars. Mark would drive the launcher left over from the previous mission and complete the ring with the space station without slowing down. In this way, after being rescued, Mark regained hope after learning that he and the Air Mouse had developed a rescue plan. However, there was still a big problem that needed to be solved. The spaceship that had just been built had exploded. If he built another one, then the time will be hurt. But at this time, the director thought of a way. They asked for help from the China Space Administration. Then there was the scene at the beginning. In a blink of an eye, after 200 days, Mark, who lacked food, had become skinny and weak. The space station was about to reach Mars, and he had to prepare to go to the launcher. Mark modified the Mars exploration vehicle and brought all the solar charging panels and air circulation systems and all the remaining food. On the 461st day on Mars, he left the base and boarded the Mars rover to the launcher. The journey was long and lonely. In addition, no one had walked through the places in 4.5 billion years. There were unknown dangers everywhere. The longest driving time of the exploration vehicle was 4 hours each time, but it took 13 hours to charge, so he either slept or drove all the way. 77 days later, he finally arrived at the launch site safely. Mark finally boarded the last straw that saved his life. The first thing he did when he came up was to remove all the glass on the launcher, even the top cover, and replace it with a plastic sheet. The reason for doing this was to reduce the weight of the launcher and let it fly farther. On the 560th day, the space station successfully reached the orbit of Mars, but it could not get too close to Mars because the gravity of Mars would directly cause the space station to crash. Their every move was watched by the world. All mankind was watching. There were still 12 minutes left before the launch of this Mars rescue. Mark changed the space symbol and successfully connected the voice function. This was the first time Mark had communicated with an outsider in 2 years. Then the engine was ignited and Mark successfully flew away from Mars. Although the weight of the rocket was reduced, but when the fuel ran out, it did not reach the ideal altitude. It was still 68 kilometers away from the space station. The captain immediately ordered to move towards the launcher at full speed. It was expected to reach the destination in 39 minutes. Slowing down became their problem. The captain suddenly got an idea. They made a bomb and blew up the gas door. In this way, they successfully slowed down under the effect of reverse thrust. The captain quickly put on the space charm and the safety rope and immediately went to the direction where Mark was. However, an accident still occurred. Because the safety rope was not long enough, he could not reach Mark at all. So Mark also took a risk. He pierced the space charm and used the reverse thrust to fly towards the captain like Iron Man. Finally, Mark, who had been trapped on Mars for 561 days, was successfully freed. The whole film ends here.